Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This kit rescue and review covers the B-2 Advanced Technology Bomber, that's the ATB, by REVL. It was released only once in 1987, and it's a 172 scale, number 4577 kit. The finished dimensions are a whopping 26.5-inch wingspan, 15 inches in length, and 2.5 inches high. Now the B-2 was developed from its ill-fated predecessor, the YB-49, which is a fascinating story in itself. Now this is a what-if kit that was rushed into production after credible reports of the existence of the top-secret B-2 aircraft leaked out. The kits like these are getting harder to find, but they're on auction sites, etc. And if you see an interesting kit that looks like it could be rescued, take a chance. They probably won't be reissued, at least not with the price of new offerings skyrocketing faster than a B-2. They can be attractive modeling projects in their own right. Two things to keep in mind though. You're going to want to make sure it's something you really want to do because there's extra work involved. And you have to take what it gives you. As an example, some parts are welded together so tightly that disassembly can destroy the pieces. So simply work around them and detail it as best you can. This one caught my eye because it's a piece of modeling history. It's not an accurate facsimile of the B-2 Spirit, as we discovered about a year after the kit was issued, when the real plane was revealed. But back then the model makers were rabid to get the jump on the competition and push something out like this to market to the community of builders. Now they would take a chance, hoping for a couple years of sales to recover the investment. Unfortunately, that floundered, as the real B-2 was shown about a year later. The kit didn't resemble the real plane that looks and it's more like a flounder look or a manta ray than a bat to me. But this kit was partially and incorrectly started, so I decided to see if I could rescue it from the dumpster. And follow along and I'll show you how to rescue a bat. Here's what I got in the kit, and as you can see there's 4 wing halves and one large tree of parts, mostly landing gear and wheels. And I think there may have been a separate tree for the AGM missiles, but the fuselage halves and the flaps for some of the wells, along with the canopy and the interior bucket, have all been installed and were glued together. These are the decals that came with the kit, and they're basically your secret airplane markings along with the SAC banners. But unfortunately I wasn't able to use all the decals, and we'll get into that a little later. The first thing that I did was to disassemble the 2 upper and lower halves of the fuselage, and I used my favorite knife. You can tell it's been pretty well used. It's a putty knife, just like the kind you use to put putty on window glazing with. It's got a sharp edge and it's fairly strong, but it's pretty thin, so it fits right in between any gap in the fuselage halves. And then I just ran it along there gently and carefully until the parts split, and then I could take the fuselage apart. Now you may find if you have parts that are really welded tight, you may need to use a what we call a razor saw to actually cut the pieces apart at appropriate places. Disassembly revealed the Made in USA copyright from 1987 inside the halves. I also found the REVL copyright on the outside of one of the wings, which was a common practice back then, and that'll need to be removed and sanded off. After studying the instructions, I went ahead and used the legend for the paint callouts to find where each color of the items were on the instruction sheet and numbered those appropriately with the color keyed markings. Opening the fuselage also showed that the intakes were installed backwards. They should actually be pointed in the opposite direction. So anyway, I removed the cockpit, and then I removed the intakes. They weren't glued in too well because they actually didn't fit the contours. So those were taken apart. It also revealed the fact that on the inside of the intakes were some pretty heavy ejector pin marks, and there was a little bit of flash on the front end of that needed to be sanded and cleaned up. The cockpit area revealed three seats, and I was able to remove the canopy, which had not been painted as far as the frame goes, which was nice, so then I could reuse that. You can see here in the red circles there's some pretty extensive sink marks where some of the interior ribbing was that needed to be filled, and the white arrow shows glue marks and fingerprints that I found on the model. The white arrows here show that on the underside of the fuselage the landing gear flaps for the front and the weapons bay flaps were installed. One of them incorrectly, it was a little crooked, and we'll be taking that off later. But also the posts that are used to put the guided missiles into their weapons bay were they had been broken off and they were filled in, so those will need to be corrected. The exhaust deflectors were binding and were at different angles, so I removed those in order to do a little work on them too. There was also a bulwark in the back that is used to angle the deflectors and probably give a little stability to the fuselage, but I had to remove that entirely. As a testament to the mold makers, this was about the only flash I found on the kit, just a little bit on one of the wingtips. And quite frankly, I have to give the engineers and designers and tool makers kudos, because the convoluted forward leading edge of the wing, where the two wings and the fuselage come together, were absolutely remarkable in their fit. They were a perfect fit despite the complex contour of that shape. Looking over the AGMs, I noticed that there was quite a seam that they really weren't glued together properly, but rather than risk splitting them all apart, I simply filled the seams in. And then I drilled a couple holes in the top and added new posts for mounting them to the weapons bay. So I began to fill in the sink marks on the fuselage and cleaned up some of the thumbprints and discoloration. The arrow here shows that the weapons bay door there had been removed and will be reset for the correct angle. There were two of the AGMs that had contained originally the posts that were used to mount them into the center module there in the weapons bay, and I re-drilled the holes in the weapons bay in the center there. You can see in the white circle, and then you can also see the corresponding posts that were put into one of the AGMs there in the red circle above that. I had finished adding some of the putty to the bottom of the seam there and kind of going over the lines of the wings to make sure that they don't disappear with paint. And I'd also drilled a hole where the exhaust port is on the back of the AGM, put them on toothpicks ready for paint. And then I took the parts all together that needed to be sprayed a light gray paint, and that included the cockpit area too. After the primer gray had dried, I painted the seats green and highlighted the seat belts with some satin black, and then also the buckles. I used a Molotow chrome pen to highlight those. I blacked out the exhaust port and the intakes there on one of the center AGMs and added some decals that I'd printed out on some decal paper with my inkjet printer, just to see what they would look like if they were standalones in the weapons bay. Next, I got to work on the fuselage halves by using a 180 grit sand stick to rough sand the edges all the way around, and then I went back over it with a fine sand stick to make sure that it was a good flat surface for gluing. I then took and finished off the upper hull itself with all of the sanding and finishing that needed to be done on the sink marks. You can see them here at the back where the exhaust stanchions were inside, and there was quite a bit of work to do there. The gluing surfaces on the intakes needed to be cleaned up, as well as those ejector pin marks needed to be sanded and filled in. See the wing spot there on the underside of one of the wing areas where it needed to be filled in. There was quite a bit of sink mark on that. The exhaust deflectors didn't really fit well in between the slats on the upper wings and lower wings, so I went ahead and widened that out. You can see in the red circle the item at the top has the wider slot there to fit into those stanchions. This is the bulk head that's in the rear of the plane at the tail, and the arrows there indicate where you're supposed to lay the deflectors to get them at the proper angle. But I found that that was iffy, and so I just glued them to the upper and lower hull. I covered the canopy with what's called bare metal foil. I put that down so that I could use it as a mask. And then I went ahead and cut it out so that the framework was exposed and the foil continued to cover the glass. When it's done, you can pull the foil off and you have a nicely masked canopy with a frame. Now we have the upper and lower fuselage halves all cleaned up and we're ready to install the deflectors, and I just glued those into place now that they fit around the center stanchion there and up to the edge of the fuselage halves. And you can see here they're all in place and ready to be assembled. I got a piece of K&S aluminum stock from the hobby store to use not only as a display stand stock but also to reinforce the wing, and we'll show you how to do that. I butted the wing up to the lower fuselage and then I clamped it together, and that showed me where to mark a place to lay the aluminum tube in order to solidify the entire wing to the fuselage. So I used a razor saw to cut the fuselage edges out where the rod would lay in place. I did the same thing on the other side for the other wing and fuselage halves and marked where it would go, as you can see with the white circle there. I also glued the intakes into position in the right direction. Next, I used the existing locating tabs and I glued the wing to the fuselage on the lower half, and then I clamped it up and let it dry. Then I added the port side wing and I fitted the aluminum tube, which is about 13 inches long, so that it would fit into the airframe and still not hinge on the wings at the edges. I put the upper wings into position so that I could mark where the needed to be cut out for the aluminum tube that goes through the fuselage. You can also see that there are some stripes on the outer section of the tube, and I put that there so that I could grind that piece of the tube off to allow the edges to be glued very properly and solidly to the wing. I had opened the two ends of the tube up a little bit to allow some glue to go on there and make a good bond, but you could also probably just flatten it with a hammer if it's a malleable metal. And then I used a little liquid CA glue to glue it into position so that it would stay put. Next, I used a large amount of epoxy glue to glue this rod into position and stabilize it into both the wing and the center section of the hull. I glued the windows into the airframe with some clear glue, and then I did the same thing and glued the cockpit into position over that on the upper fuselage. Those components glued together into the lower fuselage, I was ready to start assembling the pieces, but before I was onto that, I did one more thing. I drilled a 1/4 inch hole just aft of the weapons bay, as you can see here in the red circle. I took a section of a Bic pen casing and then I angled it and put it into position over the hole on the inside of the lower fuselage up against the rod for reinforcement, and then I glued it heavily with epoxy and put it into shape there. Finally, I put a little cap on top of it so that the rod that came through for the display wouldn't run into the top of the fuselage half. Now I glued the upper fuselage into position and it fit perfectly onto the cleaned up lower half. I then used some liquid cement to glue the port side upper wing into position against the lower wing. Glue the other upper wing half into position, and when that's done, you can begin filling the seams. Also note that I filled the seam, what little there was, around the entire wing area of the airplane. Now you may have noticed that the front gear here had the wheels already installed on it, and one of the wheels had been broken off, so we'll have to fix that later. But here is the rest of the main landing gear struts. They go together pretty well, and there's going to be a lot of close-up so that you can see how it's assembled. But here also are the other wheels. They're all on one tree, and then what you do is I took and painted those white because it's easier to paint the outside for me, and so I went ahead and sprayed those to let them dry. Now there's two smaller wheels for the front forks, but struts, but there's also the rest of the units that have a inside and outside to them. The one with the large 3 lugs, that's the inside wheel. So go ahead and assemble those and clean up the ridge where they come together. After cleaning up all the seams, I placed some painter's tape as a mask over the installed canopy, and there's a couple pieces there at the top that will be painted for the underside color, some flaps that need to be painted that color. And as you can see on the underside, I put some masking tape in some of the nacelles there in order to keep paint out so that the landing gear could be glued in more properly. Now here's the colors that I use. I found this Krylon chalky finish. It's anvil gray. It was perfect dark gray for the upper surface, and then there's just some Model Masters light gray there for the underside. So here's what the upper side looks like after the anvil gray is applied, and I used a soft edge technique around the edges of the outside of the wings from both directions in order to keep a soft mix right around the seam in the middle for both those different colors, and it came out very nicely. After the paint had dried, I gave the overall a coating of floor polish, the future style or pledge style floor polish, and then I began to put some of the decals into position. Unfortunately, I found that the decals weren't in too good a shape. The adhesive turns kind of gluey, and the gray all but disappeared against the color once the decals dried, so I wasn't able to use those. I had masked the wells off there, and so I pulled the wells out, and that's an unpainted finish down there. You can see the tape there on the right. I had also discovered that as a consequence of the extra weight in the back, I had what's called a tail dragger, and if you were to try and display this vehicle on its wheels, the back end would sag down and pull the front wheel off. So I put some holes in the forward end of the weapons bay, and I squirted some putty in there, just some regular sticky putty, and gave it enough weight so that if I ever did want to display it with the wheels down on the ground, then I could do that. So now with pledge coating over the entire surface, I was able to go ahead and continue with the decal applications, and I used the large Bluefield decals, but I found the rest of them were difficult to get to apply. They curled, and so what I did was I had made a photograph of the decals, and then I reproduced them on some decal paper using an inkjet printer, and most of the decals that I used then were reproductions of the original. Once the decals were in place and dried, I gave the overall finish a coating, a couple of coats of Krylon crystal clear paint, and it is a shiny paint, and I used a technique that's called a dry spray, where I backed the spray can off about 18 inches and kind of let it float and hit the surface to emulate a coating such as would be the case on a super secret stealth plane that has the coating that's made to deflect any kind of radar, and so that's the technique I used, and it came out pretty well. So I gathered up the AGM weapons and the one weapon bay door that needed to be glued into place, and I started to work on that. As I mentioned earlier, you could dress these up quite a bit if they were standalone, and in that case you could then, after you paint the rest of the weapons bay white, you could paint the relief missiles that are engraved in there same color gray and dress them up with decals, and then just use the center one here as your main display. Well, I may have mentioned before the weapons bay doors here were all pretty well heavily glued into place, and removing them generally would have just broken off all of the details used there. So I decided to leave them in place except for the one that was crooked, and then that necessitated having to paint them all by hand. So I painted all the weapons bays and window wells flat white as is suggested. After the weapons bays had dried, I went ahead and installed all 6 of the AGMs in the triple clusters on each side into the weapons bays, just using some tube glue to make sure they stayed in place. Next, gather up the parts for the landing gear, including the flaps that have been painted for the exterior on the bottom. Now, the front landing gear is pretty straightforward. You can see that it goes into 2 holes in the rear, and then it slides the front strut up to some angled sections at the bottom of the front well. And then the rears, of course, they go into place and they fit where they should go pretty properly. You shouldn't have too much trouble with it. I'll show you plenty of angles here so that you can see how they are built and displayed. And then the small flap and the large flap are placed in front of the landing gear in the rear. And of course there's already been the extra door that was repositioned, put into place, as you see, and those are they're pretty sturdy structures, but the plastic in mine was very brittle, and one of these struts actually cracked as the glue was drying, that apparently it had a little torque on it. So I decided even way before this not to display this kit with the wheels down. Any sideways movement would break them. Next we can add the wheels. As you can see, they're here on some tape. They were painted a rubber gray, dark gray color to emulate those big tires on the big bombers, and they're just simply snapped into place there. They all fit pretty well, but you may want to use your hobby knife to clean out the hole where they're applied, and then go ahead and make sure that they're lined up and they're all in line. Next, I began work on my display stand, and I roughed up a little bit of the end of the tube there so it would take glue, and I cut a triangle out of some evergreen stock to act as a stabilizer. I then fit it up there and then put a little drop of super glue in place to keep it into position. And then once that had dried, I pulled it out and added a considerable amount of epoxy glue to make sure that it stays into place and provides a good support for lateral integrity on the display stand. I bought a couple of wooden plaques from Hobby Lobby and painted them to make a display stand. They're about 8 by 10, and this will give it a nice sturdy solid base with enough weight to keep it from tipping. And then I drilled a hole at an angle to accept the display stand. And of course I had also painted the entire stalk and the triangle that I cut flat white to match the rest of the motif here. And as you can see, it's all done, and there you have it. And we've saved our bat. It's looking pretty healthy, and these things will probably never be reissued. And if you find a nice model that you take to a liking to and you think that it's worth preserving, try and save it. They'll probably never be made again, and if they are, even so, prices are going up quickly, even for new kits. So sometimes it's worth the effort to put a little elbow grease into something that, and in my opinion, this is a piece of modeling history, and it's harkens back to the day when model makers were all in competition with each other, and they were just putting out some massive amounts of stuff. But here's my bat. I'm proud of her, and she's going to sit on my shelf for quite a while now and look real proud. So I'm happy to say that if I were you, I'd find one and put it on your shelf. Just to show you, as a matter of scale, here is the B-2 compared to the F-117 stealth fighter. Itself a pretty good sized craft. As you can see, no comparison. And so I'm happy with the way she turned out. I hope you'll give one of your favorites a try too. Well, there you have it. We hope you liked this premium model kit rescue and review. And so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. But you can find us on Facebook and at our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.